As Christ Community Church celebrates its 40th year, founding pastor Jim Nicodem has shared a series of talks with church staff about how God has been on the move over 4 decades. These are not meant to be sermons or in-depth theological studies, but instead are stories and reflections from a founding pastor. We now invite you to listen in as Pastor Jim shares what has been and what will continue to be the core legacy values of Christ Community Church.
Icebreaker question for you here. If the 50th anniversary is represented by gold, what represents the 40th anniversary? Anybody know? Yeah. No. Ruby. Who said ruby? Wow, you get something. Eric, give her something, would you? Yeah. This has got nothing to do with anything I'm about to say, but I just love, I love Ruby. My grandmother's name was Ruby. She served as a missionary for years in India. My granddaughter, 9-year-old granddaughter's named Ruby after her great-grandmother. So I like it. So we're coming up on the 40th anniversary, just a couple years away, which has caused me to reflect on almost 4 decades of ministry. Both from the standpoint of what there is to celebrate about God's faithfulness to us, but also in trying to identify what are the legacy values. Okay, what are the values that I hope as a senior leader I've instilled in the church? What are the values that I hope as a staff member you've picked up on and that you personally own? I mean, they haven't been imposed on you. You own them. And what are the values that we hope will carry us into the future? They may be manifested in a different form, but they're still foundational to the life of our church. We're going to cover prayer. And as I said last time, these presentations are not meant to be a Bible study on the legacy value. They're meant to be kind of a walk down memory lane. They're a historical recap starting with me. So as the founding pastor, I want to tell you how each value became important to my life and then how it's been reflected in the life of the church. So let me just start with regard to prayer, talking a moment or two about my life. I was extremely fortunate to be raised by 2 parents who prayed. In fact, I would say that prayer was the defining characteristic of my mom and dad's walk with Christ. They prayed about everything. I have this indelible memory in my mind of the day my dad lost his job. He was president of an insurance company. He had started the company from scratch. He had grown it to about 200 employees. Along the way, he brought a guy on board who was out of work, needed a job. Dad brought him on board, brought him up through the leadership ranks. What he didn't know is that this guy had his sights on Dad's job. And he began to connive behind Dad's back and managed to talk the board of the company to fire my dad and put him in Dad's place. And so Dad came home from work having just lost his position of the company that he had started to a guy that he had brought on board. And I was in junior high at the time. So there was a lot about that I wasn't going to get. Mom and Dad were having kind of a hush-hush conversation about it. It wasn't like out there at the dinner table. And I will never, ever forget. They talked for a minute or two and then retreated to their bedroom. And I followed them down the hallway and the door was open about a foot. And I looked in and they were kneeling beside the bed, just pouring their hearts out to God. And I knew that this was their regular practice, that whenever they faced a challenge, a difficulty, a crisis, a dilemma, a big decision that had to be made, it was prayer. So that has been indelibly etched on my mind. My dad was the most resilient person I know. He recovered from that really well, amazingly. And his favorite line growing up whenever we hit hard times was, "God's still on the throne. God's still on the throne." And I think the reason my dad knew that God was still on the throne is because Dad spent so much time before the throne of God in prayer. He was a prayer. And Mom was the same way. We just celebrated her at her memorial service here in this room 2-3 weeks ago. Many of you were there. And if you were there, you know that was the predominant value that was associated with her life by the eulogizers. Everybody talked about what a prayer my mom was. And I had just a number of people say to me after that memorial service they said, just being challenged by your mom's example, I want to up my prayer game. So you would think with parents like that, I would have picked up on this same prayer habit early in life, but I didn't. We had family devotions. Every morning at the breakfast table, a portion of scripture would be read, a devotional booklet was passed around, and then every one of the kids, 4 of us, had to pray. And each of us had a rote list of things, and we said it in the same way, and you just got through that list as quick as you could. And I always tried to be the first to pray, because if you weren't first, one of your siblings might steal your list, and then it'd come to you and you'd have nothing to pray about. So I don't have a recollection of prayer playing a super important role in my life, not even after coming to Christ. I mean, one of the reasons, of course, that my heart wasn't moved by prayer is it took me to freshman year of college before I surrendered my life to Christ. But even after I surrendered my life to Christ, I don't remember prayer playing a super important role in my life, even through my first 2 ministry gigs. So our first one was in the Boston area, Boston suburb, and we saw God lead literally a couple hundred students to faith in Christ. It was amazing. And yet I look back and we didn't pray a whole heck of a lot. And then I was a pastor of a small church out on Cape Cod. And again, I can't remember prayer being a huge part of that. I mean, I prayed, but my prayer life wasn't yet driven. Don't miss this point, because this is the big point of what I want to say. My prayer life wasn't yet driven by desperation. By desperation. All that changed when we launched Christ Community Church. For starters, this group, you've heard the group referred to before, the 6 couples that started the church. So there are 2 couples in their 40s, 2 in their 50s, and 2 in their 60s. And we were going to start a contemporary style church in a movie theater. Sue and I were late 20s. And so there was this sense of, how are we going to pull this off with this band of people that God has put together? And then on top of it, just recently you heard Eric Ferris tell the story how we asked these 6 couples to each write on a slip of paper how much money they thought they could give to this effort. And we added it up and we spread it out over 6 months. And honest to goodness, this is the truth. They said, we can offer you this amount of salary. It was a really, really meager amount, and the money runs out in 6 months. So if we haven't grown, if we don't have new givers in the pipeline, we just don't have anything else to pay you with. So at that point in life, I realized my back was up against the wall. If this church didn't take off, I'd be looking for a new job in 6 months. And my life in ministry my prayer life began driven by desperation. I had to start praying as if everything depended on it, because it did. It did. If you follow the Bible Savvy reading schedule, a week or so ago, we came across the story of Jesus' disciples being asked to pray for the son of a man who was demonized. And the demon was throwing him into the fire, and he was foaming at the mouth. And it wasn't all of the disciples, it was 9 of them, because 3 of them were with Jesus on the Mount of Transfiguration. And the disciples didn't pray. They tried to cast the demon out of this guy. Nothing happened. Jesus comes down from the Mount of Transfiguration, and he casts the demon out. And later, you remember the story? The disciples say, why couldn't we do that? And Jesus responds, Mark 9:29, this kind of evil spirit can only come out by prayer. Some of the manuscripts, ancient manuscripts, add and fasting. In other words, really intense prayer. So wimpy prayers aren't going to do the job. A whole lot of important ministry is not going to happen unless people are serious about praying it into reality. I want to say that again. A whole lot of important ministry is not going to happen unless people are serious about praying it into reality. If we are not driven by desperation, if we don't feel like our back is against the wall, if we are content with meager ministry results, then our lives and ministries will not be marked by earnest prayer. So earnest prayer needs to take place at 3 levels. Level number 1, the personal level. Okay, however you want to say it, whatever adage you want to use, Speed of the leader, speed of the team, or my favorite, fish stinks from the head down, or you can't impart what you don't possess. I mean, the point of all those adages is, if we want Christ Community Church to be a praying church, then the people in this room right now, and our elders, and our lay leaders, have got to be no holds barred prayers. Do you believe that? Do you really believe that? Or are we hoping that our church will be a praying church even if we as leaders are only mildly committed to prayer in our own lives? You hear me ask you this question a lot, not just about prayer, but about other values. What if everybody at Christ Community Church prayed like you pray? Would that be a good thing for us or a bad thing? Okay, would that bring the level of prayer down, or would that cause the level of prayer to rise? Now, things sink or swim with leaders and their example. Peter tells us, you don't lead by lording it over others, you lead by setting an example. So what example are we passing on to the people of our church? Acts chapter 6, first mega crisis in the life of the church. You know the story. There's a contention in the church. They've got a food distribution program. Some people are getting more than what they deserve. Some people are getting less. And it's racial discrimination that's driving the whole thing. So they got a problem that's got to be addressed. So the staff of the church, who at that point are the apostles, they get people together and they say, okay, here's how we've chosen to deal with it. We're appointing some people to administrate this program well, which they did. But they added, but we're not going to get involved in this because we've got two really important tasks as the staff. Remember what the two tasks are? Our job is preaching the word and praying. Now, I think this especially pertains, I think in a general sense, it pertains to everybody in this room who's on the staff of our church, even if you're in a support role, but especially to those of you called to a pastoral role. Prayer and the word have to be at the foundation of all that we do. As a senior leader on our staff, I have tried to be a good role model in this regard. Prayer plays a significant role in my life, in my daily devotions, in my sermon preparation, in the meetings I lead, in my community group. 2 or 3 times a week, I try to do an extended period of prayer where I'll spend the first 30 to 45 minutes journaling what it is I want to pray about, and then I typically take it for a walk. If the weather's nice, and for me, nice can even be freezing cold, but I'll hit the river path and just walk for an hour, hour and a half and pray. And every time I do this, there's a part of me that says, there's so many things I got to get done. I can't afford to take this 2-hour chunk and devote it to prayer because these other things are not going to get done. But all I can say is that I can't imagine what my life and ministry would be like without those extended prayer times. In fact, I'll be honest with you, occasionally when I feel like I suck as a pastor or suck as a husband or a dad or a friend, and there are many occasions when I feel that way, I remind myself, well, I'd be even worse if I didn't pray as much as I do. So I got something going for me, at least a virile prayer life. Most of you are aware of the fact that my first book was called Prayer Coach, and I hope you'll read it if you haven't read it yet. Let me tell you why. In the early days of Christ Community Church, because of this dawning realization of the importance of prayer, I determined to teach the men of the church how to pray. This wasn't a sexist sort of thing. Quite frankly, it was not only because I, as a guy, was trying to relate to guys in an area of their life I thought needed to be developed, but it was also my observation that women tended to pray more and better than guys did. So once a month, every month, we had a Saturday morning breakfast. And my topic at those breakfasts was always the same. I always taught on prayer. Every time I picked a different aspect of prayer and I taught about it, and I taught about it in the most practical way I could. So at the end of the breakfast, we would then break up into groups of 3 or 4 and we would put into practice the things that they had just learned. Back then, I had 2 or 3 books on prayer on the shelves in my office. And I kept looking for just the right one that I could recommend to these guys. Like, here's the book, read the book, it'll help you learn to be a prayer. But the fact of the matter was, the authors who'd written those books on prayer, they were either very mystical, or they were deeply theological, here's the theological foundation for prayer, or they were just impractical. Like they were over the top. I remember reading about one guy who got the nickname Camel Knees because of all the hours he spent in prayer. And I thought to myself, I can't share this with just normal guys. They're not going to pray for 4 hours at a stretch. How is that sort of an example going to help the Men of Christ community? So eventually I just wrote the book I'd been looking for. And it is it's just a compilation of all the stuff that I had taught month after month, year after year at those breakfast gatherings. It is unashamedly a how-to book. It's, as the subtitle puts it, it's meant to get readers off or out of the grandstands and onto the praying field. It's not a book, if you got a copy of it, it's not a book that I intended to be read in 1 or 2 sittings. So if you got a 4-hour flight to San Diego and you read through Prayer Coach, no, you did it wrong. So I want the book to be read 1 chapter at a time. And before you move on to the next chapter, for you to say, how can I put this into practice in my life? I teach in the book how to overcome roadblocks to prayer. I teach how to pray on the spiritual armor of Ephesians 6. I teach how to pray the attributes of God, how to pray the 3 open prayer for evangelistic opportunities, how to pray for the persecuted church, how to pray for your kids if you're a parent, how to pray for spiritual leaders, how to pray prayers of confession, how to pray against demonic attacks. If you don't pray more after reading Prayer Coach, you ought to get your money back, because that's the intent of the book. Now, having said that, I want you to know I don't get any money anymore for initially I got some royalties from Crossway, but along the way, when, unless your book's a bestseller by Max Lucado, after about 10 years, they retire your book. So they're about to retire Prayer Coach after 10 years. And I said, hey, can we buy the copyright? So we bought the copyright so we could reproduce it and sell it to people at, basically just a little bit more than our cost. Second level, leadership level. Christ Community Church's first office, when we were holding our services, our weekend services, and again, this is all walk down memory lane stuff for your amusement, okay? When we were still renting a movie theater on the weekends, our first office was in my folks' basement. And that's because I was the only staff member. Okay, then we started to grow the staff and we needed an office. So we rented an office in an office building on 64 just west of Randall Road, right next to the bowling alley that's there. Our third location for an office was a 2-story brick home downtown St. Charles, just half a block up from Colonial Ice Cream. How convenient. That was wonderful. So 2 stories. My office was the attic of this building. Now, here's the point of telling the story. Our offices kept moving. Our staff kept growing, but one thing was constant. From day one, we prayed together as a staff. From day one, I don't know why I did that. No one told me to do that, but we set aside 2 or 3 days a week when we would pray a concerted amount of time each time we prayed. So I'm glad we did it because it not only ensured that we were tapping into God's infinite resources through prayer, but here's a byproduct that I hadn't counted on. But when I look back, I say, oh my, this was a marvelous byproduct. It was staff unity. Because when you spend that much time talking about your ministries, so you're not siloed, but everybody's hearing about what you're doing in your area of ministry, and they're concerned for you and they're praying for you. I look back, and there has never been a point in time where we had a staff split or a serious defection of a large clump of people, and I credit it to the fact that the staff that prays together stays together. I really think one of the most important byproducts of all the time we spent praying together, you guys, is that you just learn to love each other and care about one another's areas of ministry. In my journal every week, I jot down the names of the people that I was praying with, either on the Zoom prayer on Tuesday or the in-person prayer on Thursday, and I pray for those people that I got a chance to pray with. I'm just so thankful for the opportunity we've had to do that together. And it's not that our staff has been without an occasional train wreck. There's been at least 2 staff who we had to publicly let go because of immorality in their lives. And those were, dark days momentarily for our church. But I really think the reason we weathered them and they weren't more destructive than they were was because of the amount of time we spent in prayer together. So staff prayer, it's a Christ Community Church legacy value. I don't think you'll find too many churches around the country who devote as much time to focused praying as a staff as we do. Now, let me talk about another aspect of leadership prayer. Every one of you serves on a team at Christ Community Church. You may be on the creative arts team. You may be on the next gen team, the admin team. Your team has regular planning meetings. My team is the elders. And so I just want to share with you something I've learned about including prayer in my meetings in the hopes that you'll find something applicable for your team meetings. For years, our elder meetings, we prayed twice in every elder meeting. We prayed at the beginning and we prayed at the end. We prayed at the beginning, and it was kind of a formal introduction to the meeting. And we prayed at the end after we had already made all our decisions. We prayed at the end after we had talked about so many things that nobody could remember all the stuff we should pray about. We prayed at the end after we were all so exhausted and we just wanted to wrap up and go home. You see how this sort of an approach to prayer was horribly ineffective, not to mention probably an insult to God. And I finally woke up to the realization I was not using prayer appropriately in those meetings, and so I changed my approach. So if you show up in an elder meeting these days, you will see me the whole time with a dry erase marker in my hand. Because as we begin to talk about things, I put the topic we're talking about on the whiteboard, whether it's on the agenda or it's something that came up spontaneously. And as soon as we get about 4 or 5 things on the whiteboard, we stop, we get into small groups, we pray for 10 to 15 minutes, and then we say, okay, what's next? And we keep on. And, when your elder meeting is like 3 hours long, we end up having probably 3, 4 times at least of prayer, 10, 15 minutes at a shot throughout the course of the meeting. I pass that on to you because if you're not doing something like that, it might be something you want to start including in your planning meetings for your team. Talk a bit, then stop and pray. Talk a little bit more, then stop and pray. Keep going back. Talk and pray and talk and pray. I encourage you to weave prayer into your planning meetings. Don't just start and end with that. By the way, I sometimes forget to follow my own advice in this regard. And so I'm preaching to myself here. And I love it. I love it when in the context of a planning meeting I'm in, somebody says, maybe we should stop and pray about this now. It's like, this is so great. The prayer coach is getting coached here, And so I love it when someone picks up on that and says, we need to pray. So I encourage you to work it into your planning meetings. One final aspect of leadership prayer, when the team you lead or just the team you play a significant role on is ready to take the field and head into a game, don't head into the game until your team has prayed it up. Okay, and I'm not talking about a 2-minute perfunctory prayer. I'm not talking about the sports team that does the Our Father in the locker room before they burst out onto the field. Okay, that is prayer as a formality. That's prayer as a good luck charm. I'm talking about devoting a good 10 to 15 minutes to prayer, making sure that everybody on your team knows that spending time before taking the field is really, really important, and encouraging everybody on the team to participate by praying. So that means before the worship band takes the stage, that means before the usher greeters start handing out programs, that means before the Care Night volunteers engage with people who are walking through the door, before the Kids World or Epic or Student Ministries teams start loving on kids, you get your team together and you pray. We're about to take the field. Let's make sure God's part of this. Nikki knows that one of the things I'll ask her to do on occasion, if we're in the green room before a service, and I know who's involved in the service, who's going to be on the stage, and I don't see all of those people in the green room, I will say to her, find out where so-and-so is. Because I don't want a single member of our team standing on that stage believing that they can bring it just in their own steam. Again, I keep going back to the thread of desperation. I want everybody who's going to be out there in front of people feeling like they're going to be bare naked unless they're prayed up. And because that's how I feel. I want everybody to feel the same way, like, wow, we need to go in prayerfully. So I encourage you to weave more and more prayer into your leadership. One last thought about praying too with your team before they take the field. You may need to coach your team in that regard. Like, don't assume that everybody who's part of your serving team is already a prayer. They may not be. And so, one of the things that I'll do on occasion is I'll come up with 6 or 7 things that I think we need to pray about relative to what's going to happen in our serving that's going to ensue. And I'll go around the group and say, hey, would you pray for this? And you pray for this, and you pray for that. Because sometimes all people need to know is, what do I pray for? So give them something to pray for. Do that with your Kids World team or your student ministries team or your Karenite team or whatever. Give each person something to pray for if that helps. Let people know that if they're uncomfortable praying out loud, just voice that. Just say it out loud. I know some of you probably are uncomfortable praying out loud, but you know what? God loves the sound of your voice. So I'm going to encourage you, even if it's only one sentence, just pray your sentence. Okay? There are ways to diffuse the discomfort, but find ways to include people in prayer. One last thought about this, because I often see this kind of rule of thumb violated, and I don't think it's particularly helpful. It's when the person who is the leader prays too long. Okay, and sometimes we'll break out into groups, and those of us who are veteran prayers will pray a long stem-winding prayer, but now put yourself in the shoes of the novice on your team. Nobody feels like praying when you're done praying one of those long prayers. It's like, what am I going to say? Jim just prayed for 3 minutes and, I got one sentence. So I would encourage you, this is part of the mentoring. Like if you're praying with other veterans, go for it. Pray as long as you want when you pray. But if part of your goal is to mentor the people on your team to pray more, then don't pray as long yourself. Okay, pray shorter prayers. Pray 3 or 4 times. Feel free to pray as often as you'd like, but keep your prayers shorter. One last level on which to pray, the congregation level. And I want to open this last point by making a shocking observation. While we pray a lot as a church at a leadership level, I don't know that we're doing a really great job of mentoring our congregation as prayers. I'm not sure. People sometimes will say, we are a praying church. And I'm thinking, yeah, at a leadership level, I'm pretty sure that's true. Not sure if it's true of us as a congregation. I was convicted about this again, as I often am, in reading the scripture from Mark's gospel this last week. You remember how honked off Jesus was when he entered the temple at the beginning of Holy Week and he found money changers and, people selling all sorts of stuff. And what was Jesus' beef? He quotes Isaiah 56 verse 7 where God says, my house will be what? A house of prayer. So when God's people got together at the temple, prayer was supposed to be a significant aspect of their gathering. So I keep noodling on, how do we make that happen at Christ Community Church? And there have been some failed efforts. Like I remember some years ago, I'd been visiting a huge charismatic church in Southern California. And in the midst of their worship, just high intensity worship, they stopped, assigned a topic to pray about, had people circle up in groups of 3 and everybody prayed. And there was like this buzz in the auditorium. And I thought, this is incredible. And so I brought it back to Christ Community Church. It totally flopped. In fact, I actually had people tell me they were not coming back to our services until I could guarantee they wouldn't be required to pray in a group, a small group of people. Honest to goodness. So we've tried different things to get people to pray more, include more prayer in our weekend services. One of the things I think that we've done really well, and again, this isn't a Bible study on prayer. This is just meant to say, here's who we are as a church and here's why we do what we do. One of the things we've done a lot of is intentional prayers, written out prayers, thoughtful prayers, and I love that. I was at a church, a contemporary style church in Nashville just a couple of weeks ago, and every prayer was an extemporaneous, off the cuff prayer. And I thought to myself, sorry to be judgmental. This is how pastors think when they're visiting other people's church. I thought, oh, those prayers are so shallow and they're so cliche-ish. Like every line of the prayers I heard, I could have finished the line because I've heard that line used so often. So when Clayton and others have given time and attention to writing out prayers that go before offering, or that prayers when we're praying for people who have special needs that day in church, or prayers of confession that we read antiphonally or whatever. I love that. I think it's one of the things that we've done really well. Sometimes, 2 or 3 times a year, we try to boost the whole emphasis on prayer by having a week of prayer where we publish prayer guides. And we either start the week or we end the week with an evening, a Sunday night of worship and prayer. To be honest with you, I'm not so sure how many people actually use the study guide. And I was really glad to hear Eric Ferris say to me the other day that he's working on a plan for the next week of prayer in February to do something a little different to engage people more in the praying. So this is something we're just going to continue to work on. I think we do a good job with elder prayer, where we follow through on the James 5 invitation that if you're sick, bring it to the elders of the church. And we not only make the elders available once a month, if you can't make it that month or you need prayer now, Dawn will dispatch some elders to your home. They'll come and pray. So we do a great job, but I'll tell you what drives me nuts is running into people who should know by now James 5, and they're telling me that they're sick and they're going to have a doctor visit for this or that. And I ask, have you considered going to the elders of the church? And oh no. So I want to enlist you all as people who will prompt elder prayer. The elders are ready and willing to pray, but sometimes it takes us directing people, maybe somebody in your community group, even if your community group has prayed for them, still send them the elders' way. Okay? It's just the application of James 5. Probably our best opportunity for mentoring our congregation in prayer is through our community groups. But this assumes that community group leaders own the value of prayer for their group and that they're creative and diligent about how they encourage the members of their group to pray when they gather together. So, and I just want to close with some ideas along these lines that I hope will prime the pump for those of you who are community group leaders. Or even if you're not a leader, but you play a significant role and you could have some influence with how your group prays. I just want to throw out a bunch of practical ideas. These are some of the things I do with the guys that I get together with on Thursday mornings at a coffee shop, my men's group, because I want those guys to become prayers. And so I find different ways to introduce prayer each week. So often I put prayer at the beginning of the meetings, and that's a simple little thing, but it makes a big difference if you have an early morning group and people are peeling off to go to work. Some of them are going to consistently miss the prayer time if you put it at the end. Or if you have an evening meeting, but people need to get home to relieve the sitter or whatever. It's worth considering putting prayer at the beginning so that everybody's there. Sometimes we'll open with the icebreaker, the high-low icebreaker. Or as I love to put it, the happy, crappy icebreaker. So what's a good thing and what's a bad thing that's happened in your life this week? And then after everybody's shared, I'll say, hey, let's go around now and everybody pray for the person on your left, whatever their low was. And I'll do a quick reminder, which means I got to remember what everybody's low was so I can say it in a sentence. And then everybody prays. They pray for somebody. Other times, I'll begin with the icebreaker. I'll say to the guys, what do you think your wife needs from God these days? Let's just go around. And so it's kind of cool to see guys who have never stopped to think about that, have to think about, what does my wife need from God these days? And after everybody's voiced it, I'll say, okay, now everybody pray for your wife. We'll go around and pray. And then I'll say, everybody text your wife and tell her you prayed for her, okay? You might as well get credit for this. Or sometimes I'll do it with kids. I'll say, which of your kids, if you have multiple kids, which of your kids is your greatest concern these days? If you only got one, it's easy. That's your greatest concern. But if you got 2 or 3, which of your kids is your greatest concern? Okay, now you pray for them. And so making dads pray for their kids. Other times I'll say, hey, everybody open to Galatians 5:22 and 23, fruit of the Spirit. Love, joy, peace, patience, kindness, goodness, faithfulness, gentleness, self-control. Which of these fruit do you need most in your life right now? Now I want you to pray and ask God for that fruit and tell him why. Tell him why you need it. Or other times I'll say, okay, everybody got a phone? Take out your phone. You all got the app by now, I hope, the Christ Community Church app. Go to the app. And I got two ways I could go on this. I could either say, okay, you're on our app, go to attributes of God. Everybody pick an attribute. Pick one attribute. There are 250 there. We're going to pray our attributes back to God and tell him why that particular attribute of his just blows us away. Okay, or I'll say, hey, you on the app now? Go to the prayer wall. Everybody pick a need, okay, from off the prayer wall and lead us in prayer for that individual. And then we'll all tap, we just prayed for it. And there'll be 8 of us who are sending word that we've just prayed for you. And we'll go around till everybody's had a chance to pray for somebody on the prayer wall. If we have an Inspiring Stories weekend coming up, I'll ask the guys, so we've got this Inspiring Stories guest coming. What do you think we ought to pray for? Because again, my assumption is the major reason people don't know how to pray is they just don't know what to say. So you get them to say what they should say first, and then you go to prayer. So Jessica Long's coming this weekend. How do you think we ought to pray for this? You know, I've given a short bio of her. And, you know, guys come up with stuff. Well, we ought to pray for her and her walk with Christ as she comes. We ought to pray for guests who are invited. We ought to pray for this. Right? Great. Now let's pray about all those things. See, I'm always looking for something that will get the guys to pray. Sometimes I do put prayer at the end of the meeting because the prayer that day is going to cover what did you get out of the study today? What application are you going to make? Pray it back to God. Okay, now here's the whole point I'm trying to make here. For those of you who lead community groups or rooted groups, we have got to prepare how we're going to get the people in our group to pray that week. As much effort as we put into preparing the Bible study itself. I'm convinced of that. We just have to be creative. We've got to find ways to do it that draw, as opposed to always saying, okay, let's just close in prayer. Anybody got anything to pray about? Okay, we can't let it be reduced to that. We've got to say, we're coaches. We're all prayer coaches. And so how can we make prayer happen? Prayer is a huge legacy value at Christ Community Church. And I am convinced in these days when ministry is harder and harder and harder, you know, having done ministry in the 80s and 90s when there was so much low-hanging fruit, you know, there's not much low-hanging fruit out there anymore. And if God's going to do something, it's going to be because we've prayed. And so I would just encourage you, what does that look like for you at a personal level? How can you up your game? What does that look like for you at a leadership level? If you lead a team or lead a community group, you know, what does it look like? And then as a congregation, you know, especially if you're playing a role in the formation of our services, you know, how do we introduce more prayer? How do we make sure that this church is a house of prayer that people gather at?
Thanks for joining us for this Legacy Value series. Check out the rest of these podcasts at ccclife.org/podcasts.